You're listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by NICOLA SPURLING on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples. Hello, this is a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING, and today I'm joined by Rachel Gilmore for a conversation about ethics in journalism. Rachel, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you introduce yourself briefly, please?
Yeah, so my name is Rachel Gilmore. I'm a journalist, and I kind of wear two hats. I'm here in my capacity as an indie journalist, but I also do investigative reporting for a nonprofit called Check My Ads it's trying to dismantle the disinformation economy effectively through pushing for ad tech transparency and letting advertisers actually have a say in what their ads fund and where they end up. But in my indie reporting, I cover the far right, extremism, disinformation, human rights, a lot of different human rights issues, but especially LGBTQ rights and all kinds of stuff. So yeah, I'm really excited to be here. I do a lot of TikTok videos too, if that is also helpful context.
Yes, that's exactly how I know about you as well, or how I first came to know about you was through TikTok. And if anyone in our audience hasn't seen your TikToks already, I highly encourage them to check them out. Very informative about Canadian politics, I've found.
Oh, thanks.
How did you get involved in journalism?
Well, I went to journalism school, so I had that sort of typical pathway, although I double majored in journalism and human rights, and I kept wanting to pull out of the journalism program and just focus on human rights because I felt a bit disenchanted with how effective journalism could be for actually making the world a better place. But then I had a few slightly inspiring people come to some journalism classes, and I thought maybe I could do both, and ended up getting hired out of an internship that I did right at the end of my degree at CPAC, which is basically that one that maybe you fall asleep to because it's just like the angry voices in Parliament being aired all day. I just covered Parliament Hill with the mainstream media for about 8 years, 7.5, 8 years. I was with iPolitics first, and then jumped to CTV News and then Global News until, starting my indie journey about a year ago.
Right. And I mean, I knew about the fact that you worked for CTV and Global because those were some of your more recent roles. And I remember we met at a Queer Rights Summit, and you were talking about sort of some of the reasons why you left those roles. And I'm curious to know if there's anything that you want to share here about that, and ultimately how you ended up creating a path for yourself in what you're doing now.
Yeah, I mean, on paper, I got laid off. Which is, it basically, the axe comes for anyone who works in journalism. You're just kind of waiting for your first layoff to happen. I managed to dodge it for a really long time, which is super lucky, actually. But I also was laid off at a time when I was extensively covering far-right extremism and pushing hard to tell those stories about far-right extremism and other human rights related issues as well, sort of the groups that far-right extremists tend to attack. And as a result of that, I got a lot of death threats, and it ended up turning into this whole big campaign where myself and my friends Saba Idazaz, who's with the Toronto Star, and Erica Eiffel, who's with the Hill Times, decided that we weren't just cool with accepting sexist, racist death threats for doing our jobs, and we started speaking out about it. But I think that put a lot of pressure on our newsrooms to actually do something. And while some newsrooms stepped up to the plate, others were a little less happy behind the scenes with, looking bad. Although I want to say that there were some people at Global who were really wonderful and supportive to me. But unfortunately, I happened to get hit with the layoffs in the midst of all of that with absolutely no resources. I had gotten these death threats related to things I had published at Global News. And as soon as I was laid off, I lost all support, any, security help, which I didn't have much of, but, at least it was something. I was just kind of turfed. And that was really difficult because it honestly felt a bit targeted, because not long after they laid me off, they posted a job at my bureau that was doing effectively what I did, but with a little more on camera work, which I had also done some of for Global. So it was a little bit frustrating, but I obviously can't say any of that, that it was targeted or anything for a fact, because I don't have any evidence beyond just how it felt and how I was spoken to.
Mm-hmm. And so what brought you to this, I guess, pathway of using social media as your method of reaching people independently?
In a purely like logistical sense, I started making TikToks for Global. I pitched to them like, hey, we should tell the news on TikTok because there's a lot of people there and there's a lot of disinformation there. And I think that as journalists, it's sort of our responsibility to show up where people are consuming information and, fill what would otherwise be a void. And so I started making those videos, but then they just like randomly paused them, saying that it was just briefly for a rebrand, and then never started them up again. So when they did that, I didn't want to lose the muscle of making these news TikToks. I really enjoyed making them and got a lot of fulfillment from it. So I started just posting them on my personals. And then when they laid me off, I thought, well, I have lots of time now. And I just kept making them. And then, from an ideological, I guess, standpoint, or more like in terms of my mindset, once I left Global, I realized that I had been facing a lot of pressures with respect to the stories that I wanted to tell and the kinds of stories I wanted to tell. And on TikTok, I didn't need to get an, executive's permission to write a story about, Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian American journalist who was killed by the IDF, who I had interviewed 3 or 4 of her, I had interviewed 3 friends of hers and a cameraman who filmed her death, who filmed her murder. All of these people are Palestinians who knew her personally. They're all related in some capacity or worked in journalism. And Global didn't publish that story, and I was told it didn't meet the editorial standards in large part because I didn't speak to enough voices, which is wild. If you know anything about journalism, 4 sources who directly knew someone is a pretty good number of sources. So yeah, it was frustrating. And, I also had to fight tooth and nail for every story I told on the far right. I didn't really get the sense that it was a huge editorial priority for my newsroom, which, that's their prerogative. But doing things independently, I was able to tell these stories. I was able to find my notes and put together the story I wrote on Shireen Abu Akleh and publish that on my TikTok. So people got to hear her, the voices of her friends and through them, her voice, because they told me what they thought that she would want the world to know. And it felt really empowering to be able to help with that and help, tell these stories that I find to be really important. So that's why I still do it today.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm on social media to some degree. It's not my full-time job, but I know that it's also a ton of work to create even short-form content, right? Especially the kind that you do. There's a lot of research that goes into it. There's a lot of editing, it looks like, that goes into those videos. So it must be a ton of work for you. Are you finding that it's rewarding, that you're able to make a living off of it?
It's definitely rewarding. I definitely cannot make a living off of it.
Okay.
So that's sort of the sad side of it. Global got me in the habit early of making these videos for free on top of whatever else I was doing at the time, because when I pitched it to them, they said, yeah, you can do this, but you still have to do your job that you're hired to do. And you're not going to be getting, like, you still have to publish all the stuff we need you to publish. And then you can do this on top of that. So I didn't get any like new title or raise or anything related to doing this work, and still was expected to have the same output in terms of written articles. So that, I think, set me up nicely for when I eventually had to, obviously, after getting laid off, had to find work. And I was lucky enough to get some offers quite quickly. And when I started working again full time, I kept doing the TikToks because I was already used to doing them for free on top of whatever other work I was doing. But yeah, it's hard because being based in Canada, we don't have access to the Creator Fund. So I don't get any money off of the videos I make. And I also, in some ways, this is very new ethical territory. And I don't know entirely how to navigate the very few offers I've gotten for paid collaborations. So to date, I just haven't done any, because I don't know how to feel about, you know, interweaving my incredibly like factual, rigorous, journalistically kind of my reporting that is done with journalistic standards and intersperse that with like a random sponsored ad. I just don't know how to do it on my personal, and I'm probably being overly cautious, but yeah, it's tough. So I'm lucky that I have a really good job that's really fulfilling with Check My Ads, but it's a lot of work and I'm pretty tired. But I hope it makes a difference, and that's what really keeps me going, is when, you know, people tell me that seeing my videos makes them feel as though there's someone who like cares about these issues, or, you know, that their stories are being told that otherwise maybe wouldn't get the same level of attention. So that's why I do it. And it just feels very fulfilling to do that.
Right. Okay. So that was going to be one of my questions, is sort of what inspires you to keep doing this? Because I know that something that you've had to deal with is a lot of hate in response to some of the stories that you've covered. So why do you think you receive so much pushback on the work that you're doing?
I think it's in large part because I am visible. Like, I'm, you know, my face is on all of these TikToks, which immediately puts you in a different sort of category that opens up a whole new realm of abuse. But also I'm a youngish woman doing this kind of reporting in, you know, extremism and white nationalism and neo-Nazism, and all of that tends to be dominated by male reporters. And I've had those male reporters say that they see the disproportionate amount of hate that I get relative to what they've gotten. So I think that part of it's just based on my identity. And, you know, I'm a white woman, a white cisgendered woman. So it's like, it could be so much worse too. And I've seen that when my colleagues who are women of color or gender diverse dip their toes into this world, it gets so much worse. And I think that's why I feel like it's important to do, is because while there is that pushback happens because you're poking at something that hurts and you're making a difference. And I don't think that I personally am not someone who feels comfortable working in the medium that I work in and not trying to make the world a better place for the most vulnerable. I don't want to do journalism just to, you know, break the story on who's going to be the next liberal leader, or, you know, to write about a debate in the House of Commons that day, although, you know, sometimes they can be important. But I want to do journalism because it stamps out hate in our world. It shines a light on dark corners where people are organizing and would otherwise be able to do so without any pushback. I think it's incredibly important for journalists to do that kind of work. And it really fuels me when I hear from people who are impacted by those hateful groups that seeing my work has made them feel less alone and feel like they're worthy of being protected, because they are. And that's what I want to show through my work, is that, you know, you deserve to feel safe, you deserve to be protected. And it's the job of journalists to make sure that the most vulnerable do feel that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think your reasons for wanting to do that in journalism are sort of this similar reasons to why I started this podcast, is I think it's really important to talk about those types of issues. And at the same time, it often puts you in front of, if you're criticizing certain demographics of people, some hate. And I mean, the demographics of people that you're covering are typically the most hateful people as well, right? So it's sort of this really interesting and unfortunate mix of things that I imagine creates all sorts of issues for you. I know that in reporting on the far right, as you say, there is potentially a worry about being labeled as having a political agenda, because I guess people view far right as being aligned with a specific party, perhaps. Is that something that you're worried about? Do you worry about people placing this label of having a political agenda or being politically biased on you?
More than worried about, like, it's happening. Like, it's, you know, and that is, to me, such a failing when anyone credible says that to me. I just find that to be a really ridiculous criticism that I'm really glad you highlighted, because it is so incredibly frustrating. The reality is anyone who works in this space, anyone who has reported on, researched anything related to extremism and conspiracism can tell you that the rise of far-right extremism is most the rhetoric that you hear from extremist circles is most likely out of any political party to be reiterated by either the People's Party of Canada or the Conservatives. You don't hear the NDP doing great replacement conspiracy theory. You don't hear the Liberals, the Liberals will maybe pussyfoot around and fail to protect trans folks as strongly as they really should, but they're not doing the level of, Polyev being caught on camera saying radical gender ideology and things like that, which is a dog whistle and parental rights rhetoric, which is another, framing of this debate that is just totally dishonest. And the reality is if you cover these issues as they come up in Canadian politics, you're gonna look like you're ragging on the Conservatives because they're the most credible, potentially, powerful party that is regularly deploying rhetoric that comes from these like brain-rotted far-right extremist spaces. Literally just I just saw an email that came in, a Conservative Party fundraising email that had the tagline, "Own nothing and be happy," which is the slogan associated with the Great Reset conspiracy theory. And there is no way they don't know that. Otherwise, why are they saying this? This isn't like, it never became big in the original context of a World Economic Forum employee mentioning it in some random YouTube video. It became big after a 4chan person posted it as part of an anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. And now it's deployed in all of these conspiratorial circles and constantly, you hear it all the time. So it's like, you know what you're doing, or you don't know what you're doing, and you're fueling something regardless. And I think it's really important to highlight that the fact that that's just the Conservatives and the PPC is not my fault. And if you call me biased for not falsely applying that, a claim that the Liberals are doing the same thing, then I don't know what to tell you. I'm not going to lie and misrepresent the situation so that you can feel as though I'm less biased. Because the reality is there's a difference between the perception of bias and actual bias. And in this case, you're the people who would criticize me for covering the Conservatives in this way are worried about the perception of bias as opposed to actual bias. And they're sacrificing and engaging in actual bias instead. Right. Although we could go down a whole rabbit hole about bias in journalism, but yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think we're recording this right after the debates in the U.S. between Kamala and Donald Trump, and there was this accusation of bias in those debates as well, where the moderators were simply fact-checking the candidates, right? And in the process of fact-checking, well, one of the candidates needed to be fact-checked more than the other, and so the supporters of Donald Trump, who needed to be fact-checked quite often, were saying there's bias here. And how do you push back against that? How do you say, look, I'm just trying to lay out the facts here. I'm not trying to support one party over another. It just so happens that one party is being much more factual than another party.
I think, unfortunately, I can only push back on that so much without the help of institutions that, the media institutions. If they choose to participate in that rhetoric and use that false outcry to force them to both sides things that should not be both sides, or, frame something as inequitable coverage or something because of a false outcry, we're screwed. So I think that, I can yell until I'm blue in the face that I'm just covering what's happening, but until people stop responding to bad faith organized campaigns on the internet that are basically Gamergate style tactics where, you know, a group will come together, create an inorganic outcry, and then media will launder it and make it seem organic by both siding an issue as a result. That until we learn how to deal with that broadly across the media spectrum, people like me are always going to be framed as biased. So what I have to do is just not let it get to me and just use deeply factual reporting, evidence everything I point out. And as long as I am providing sources for what I'm reporting, people can't really, you know, you can say that I'm being biased, but I've also got the facts laid out for you. So it's, you know, anyone who digs more deeply would see that it's not about bias so much as it is just the reality of what I'm trying to report. The bigger issue at play here is that when politicians politicize the truth and argue that there are multiple truths, it becomes bias against that individual to fact check when the truth is something that allegedly has both sides to it. Then you're taking a side when you fact check, which is unhinged and should not be something we allow to permeate our discourse, because if we can't agree upon a basic set of facts, we're doomed. And I know that there's a lot of ways that we could poke holes in, you know, there's a lot of issues with research and bias, and, you know, even peer review has its issues. And so like, I know that facts aren't always so simple, but at the same time, like if we have to agree that if there's no evidence for something, it's likely not happening. Like, you know, migrants eating cats and dogs. There's no evidence for this. So I think we can pretty safely say it's not happening and maybe we should move on, you know, and fact checking that doesn't make me biased. It just makes me rooted in reality. So.
Right. And I mean, I think at the same time, there are ways that people can present facts that highlight them in ways that could be perceived as bias. And that's maybe a different conversation. And that's also why people will say this media organization has a bias in this direction as opposed to this other direction. So what do you think about sites that attempt to ascribe political leanings to media organizations in order to combat bias or to provide people with, I guess, more fulsome information around whether or not the information that they're taking in has some sort of bias to it? Because in my mind, I'm thinking that sounds good on the surface, that you kind of have a better sense of the media, right? You go, okay, well, I'm listening to Fox News. I should know that that has an inherent right-wing bias. But wouldn't the creator of a site like that also have a bias that they would be ascribing to these media organizations?
I'm so glad you brought this up. Do you mean like these media bias chart kind of things that exist? Because I actually with my Check My Ads work, we dug into one of these ones and we looked into their methodology that they claimed that they use to assign different media outlets different levels of, you know, reliability and put them on a you know, weirdo just spectrum from right to left. And we found that what they did was they had random people effectively self-describe as right-leaning, left-leaning, and center, and they would vote on where an article should go. And they have, it's their self-description for where they stand ideologically, which it doesn't always necessarily correspond with actual, you know, ideologies. And these are just like random people. They didn't have any special expertise. And they were just reading articles and talking about it. And then it was treated as some like, you know, gospel. And then this was how we ended up with fairly reliable websites juxtaposed as having the same level of leftward bias to websites like, you know, Breitbart and stuff. It you know, and I might be getting that example slightly wrong, but it's like there were these really obviously disinfo sites that were being, you know, paralleled to sites like, I don't know, Jezebel or Mother Jones or things like that, where there's actually like a degree of research going into the articles that are being published. And I think that a lot of these websites are really problematic, and I don't think it's necessarily helpful to put things on a chart like that unless you have extremely sound methodology. And so far, I haven't found any website to have figured out the right, you know, stew of factors to be able to find a methodology that is completely accurate for that. So what I would say is I think that what's much more helpful is for individuals, and this starts in school, like kids, to be taught how to consume media critically. And that's actually something that, interestingly, I had a conversation with someone, and this is just anecdotal, it's not an overall necessarily like a trend, but someone was telling me that their daughter gets most of her news from TikTok, but because she's getting it from a source that she knows is likely has some unreliable narratives and narrators in it, she always goes and fact checks and looks into whatever, she heard to make sure that it's real. And she has those tools, those skills to be able to consume media critically and think critically about the things that she's heard. And as a result, she actually ended up, the mom said, better informed than her mom, because she not only gets exposed to more information through TikTok, but she's going out of her way to actually verify this information, make sure that she's not, being misled, and going and has the tools to think critically. And I think that that's what we really need. We don't need some random person to put things on a chart that may or may not be reliable. What we need is people to know how to think critically, what it makes something more reliable or less reliable in terms of sourcing, in terms of, expertise, in terms of what someone's background is in an area, and like whether that's reliable. And I think that if people have those tools, then, it doesn't really matter where an outlet is coming from. Although, unfortunately, like in practice, people don't have those tools, so it does very much matter. Right. But, people would be able to consume that information critically and see when something's bullshit or accurate.
Right. And I guess when it comes to posting information on social media like that, there's also this sensationalist aspect of trying to do what the algorithms want you to do in order to get in front of eyeballs, right? So yeah. I'm thinking about Johnny Harris. Do you know Johnny Harris?
Oh, I actually don't.
Okay, so he's quite popular on YouTube. He worked for an organization called Vox, I believe it was.
Oh, yeah, I know Vox.
And so he went off, he started doing his own thing, and he's become quite popular. And there was a moment, I want to say about a year or two ago, where people started fact-checking his videos and finding out that it was relatively accurate, but there was also a level of sensationalism that made the stories somewhat inaccurate or misleading. And he wasn't citing his sources. So it made it really difficult for people to go in and fact check him. If you're just a lay person watching this video and you go, I want to just double check that this is actually true. So he's actually switched things around. From what I understand, he started posting his sources, but there's still the sensationalist aspect, of course. But I'm just curious to know your thoughts around how to tell stories responsibly on social media, understanding that there are these algorithms in play that are affecting whether or not people see your content.
Yeah, so I mean, speaking personally, I think that one key thing that you just mentioned was the sourcing. I try to always, if I'm, citing a study or, I try to always make sure I have the evidence to back up whatever I'm saying or reporting. And I try to show that visually behind me. So I always film my videos in green screen style. So if I'm quoting from an indictment, not only am I saying the words, but I am saying that it's quoted from an indictment, but I've got the screenshot of the relevant section of an indictment behind me, and people can pause and they can read it themselves so that they can see, broader context that maybe I didn't have time to quote, but they can read it in context and, or go and Google based on the keywords that they can see behind me and find the indictment themselves and contextualize that information. I try to do that, obviously broadly. So if I'm citing a study, I try to make sure that I show the section that I'm citing behind me or the name of the study behind me. So either way, people are able to go and they're able to find it and look at it and decide for themselves if it's a good source. But I also put things through an initial test where I'm not just citing a random study. I try to make sure that it's got a decent, sample size that they look into and things like that, and hasn't been debunked or, subject to scrutiny that suggests it might not be the most reliable. I find that that sourcing element is key. I also try to be cognizant of not letting the algorithm dictate the content I create. So this is something I think that every creator has to sort of battle with personally. And I'm sure that even you've come across this with making your podcast. You notice that certain subjects get more eyeballs or more listens than others. And, you know, it can make you feel like, oh, maybe I should do more of that or more of this. But I try to always think critically about that. You know, for example, if I do a video on, I noticed a lot of my videos on Polyev got a lot of eyeballs, but I also noticed a lot of those eyeballs were coming from partisans, and they were sort of, it felt frustrating that it was less about the content of the video and more so that it made Polyev look bad. And so I tried to make sure that I'm always thinking about, okay, am I covering this issue because it's going to get clicks, or am I covering this issue because it genuinely matters? And I always consider that. And, you know, I think that's why sometimes if I notice that I'm covering Polyev too closely, or he's said too many unhinged things, and I did like 3 videos in a row on him, I'll be like, okay, I'm going to take a break from that, because even though those videos do well, I don't want to just like constantly go after every little thing that he says. I want to cover the things when they're important. So yeah, it's just sort of a balancing act. And, you know, there's also the flip side of that where, for example, covering stories on Gaza, the algorithm really suppresses those, and that can actually impact your content after the fact. But on the flip side, I try to make sure that that doesn't stop me from telling those stories. And I try to make sure that I still do those stories. So it's really a balance.
That's something I've noticed with this podcast as well, is there's certain topics that I'll cover and it will tank my engagement for weeks or even months, right? And it makes you not want to talk about those subjects, because now the subjects that, I mean, they're all important to me, but there are subjects that do get attention normally that are important to me that are now not getting attention because of these other subjects. So as an example, child abuse is one of the topics that we were supposed to be covering on this podcast. And there were 2 problems. One is just finding someone who's willing to talk about that on camera is challenging. And then the other one is not a single social media organization, I guess, or outlet is going to allow you to post something like that and have it reach anyone. Like, the moment I post something like that, it's not just that it suppresses it and I get maybe a few hundred views instead of a few thousand. It's like 1 view, 2 views. It's nothing. And then you can't get any eyeballs on anything after that. But at the same time, I think that's something that we really need to talk about. If it's a problem in this world and people are struggling with it, then there needs to be some avenue to talk about that. So how do you deal with that? Do you just talk about it and recognize that everything else you post around it is not going to get any attention? Or are there different outlets that you can use to talk about it so they're not impacting the other stories in that way?
So I kind of just swallow it. You know, like I just tell the story and accept the suppression that comes with it. I try not to, I try to do things to combat it. Like, you know, you can do little tricks with your captions and with the words that you use to try to make it a bit safer for the algorithm, so you don't get as overtly suppressed, like using, you know, this is why we see words like unaliving and things like that. So I try to give these videos the best chance they have while still doing them, knowing that they'll probably be suppressed. I do think that there's a calculation of, like, you know, when I covered the Terrorgram story, which is a network of white supremacists who are encouraging people to engage in terrorist attacks and white nationalist violence to try to engage in something called accelerationism, which is the ideology that you have to usher society towards a collapse through, you know, acts of terrorism to eventually be able to one day implement a white ethno-state. So it's like super unhinged, really, really awful stuff. There are so many words there that the algorithm, I was like, oh, it's going to hate this. But I was like, you know what? It's important. So with videos like that, I try not to say any of those words off the bat. And I try to acknowledge the algorithm isn't going to like this as like a little cue to the audience that like, I might need a little boost. I might need you to try to, you know, give this video an extra like, give this, the counter the algorithmic suppression by sharing this directly, if you think it's important. The one other thing I'd mention on this topic is that while mainstream media institutions do have the ability to take these stories and get them out into the world through their own platforms, which means that they aren't subject to the same suppression that, can happen algorithmically, there is still definitely a culture within newsrooms. And I know because I've been in these meetings where, we talk about, oh, stories on this do super well. Stories on this, our audience isn't that interested in this. But to a certain degree, like we have the metrics and stuff for clicks and everything, but you have to wonder about all the different things fueling that. The fact that we share these stories on social media and how many people are coming from those social media platforms and the ways in which those platforms are suppressing these stories impacts those numbers. So, the fact of the matter is that this is not just a calculation that is unique to influencer style content creators or independent creators who are posting directly on social media, although we are more beholden to the algorithm than, say, a traditional newsroom because they have that individual, they have their actual website where they can post. They are still making calculations about clicks and numbers. And unfortunately, they're making those calculations more and more, in my experience. That's something I've heard from a lot of my colleagues and former colleagues, or I guess I should say all former colleagues, because I don't work with any of them in the newsrooms now. But that's something that I've heard people complain about, that, they'll work really hard on a story that they find to be incredibly important, and the only feedback they get is that it didn't get a ton of clicks or it didn't get a ton of eyeballs. And to me, that's so removed from what journalism should be focused on. And it's frustrating to me to hear that that's a calculation that's being made, even in settings where it doesn't have to be made to the same degree.
But I also know that there's a flip side to that as well, which is I was featured in a news article where J.K. Rowling threatened to sue me. And I was told that got a ton of eyeballs. But the media organizations didn't necessarily like that it got a ton of eyeballs because it wasn't good for their advertisers. So there's a whole other consideration, right? Which is, how do you tell stories that make your advertisers happy if you're trying to make that a business?
Yeah, that is a whole chestnut. And actually a huge part of what I do at Check My Ads is there is, unfortunately, because of issues in the ad tech industry with how advertising works and the fact that it all is automated now. So basically advertisers give their money to these like middlemen, like mostly Google, who make all these promises about where their ads are going to end up, what kinds of eyeballs they're going to reach, and, what they'll be safe from, as opposed to, oh, it's not going to show up next to pornography or whatever. Or disinformation, misleading content. It still does. But what ends up happening is that we have a situation where advertisers don't know where their ads are ending up. So when they end up in, places that are unsavory, which they often do, their response is to overcompensate by engaging in this whole industry that exists called the brand safety industry. And that industry is making all of these promises to advertisers about, oh, we'll make sure that, they literally say that they can read a web page and estimate how it's going to make a person feel. Like, oh, this story is going to make someone feel sad. So you don't want to advertise next to it because then they'll feel sad and see your brand and they'll associate your brand with sadness, which is ridiculous. There's been studies done showing that when advertisements are show up next to the news, the reader trusts that brand more. So, admittedly, those studies were sought out by news outlets, and like they were the ones who requested that study be done, and I believe probably funded it. But it is a reality. I mean, I can say, speaking personally, when I see a brand on a website, that even if it's a sad story, I don't think there's a lend. When you are on a legit website, your brand is on a legit website, it does lend some credibility to your brand too. And so I don't know, the whole industry is a bit ridiculous, and some of the claims that it makes are a bit ridiculous. And the biggest thing that's arisen is a thing called keyword blocking, where advertisers, like the middlemen making them all these promises, help them to craft, or their agencies help them to craft these lists where if a word appears on a page, our advertisement won't show up there. And so these should be incredibly specific, incredibly short, but instead they're thousands of words long. And I interviewed a guy who owned a major music magazine, and he had a story that wasn't getting ads because the word song was on a block list, was on one of these lists at a music magazine. So like it is so broken. The brand safety industry is so broken. And the reality is the sketchy, bad websites that you're trying to avoid as an advertiser, they don't have ethics. So they're going to find ways around your brand safety technology and get your advertiser dollars and your brand name on their website anyways. And we've caught them doing it. So it's like, you know, it's a really ridiculous thing that just harms journalism. And there isn't really much for the newsrooms to do from this place. Newsrooms should not have to tailor their content to make it acceptable to advertisers, despite the fact that Jezebel, a feminist magazine, had its advertising department, according to 404 Media, at one point ask the website to change its tagline, because the tagline was sex, celebrity, politics, culture with teeth or something. And so there were too many words in that tagline that were getting tripped up in keyword block lists, and they were losing advertiser dollars. So it's just this ridiculous, massive problem. And this one isn't on the newsrooms. This one is on the advertising industry, and the fact that it has no oversight, no regulation. And instead of fixing that, it's made this whole brand safety industry. That's total bullshit.
Right. Oh, and coming back to social media a little bit, it's obviously helped you in reaching your audience, but I'm wondering if you sort of remove yourself from that equation a little bit, if you think it's been an overall positive thing for news media, or does it help to spread misinformation in a way that makes it more of an overall negative?
Oh, that's so hard. I am so all over the place with how I feel about social media, because I honestly, even just like big picture, I think it's in some ways a really beautiful tool. I mean, the ways that it connects you, the way that you can have friends who live on the other side of the world, the way that you can, keep in touch with people that you would have in previous generations not been able to speak to ever again, the way that it's created entire social movements, some of them positive, like the entire Arab Spring was effectively organized on social media. And then, on the flip side of it, it's incited genocides. It's, created massive mental health problems for teens. It's, and that's just the big picture. And then if you pare that down to journalism, there's so many positives and so many negatives. I mean, there's more independent creators having conversations like you and I are having today than ever. And that means that there's voices that would otherwise be suppressed in traditional newsrooms that are being heard, that deserve to be heard. But then there's also disinformers that are jumping on this, and they always found their ways. Like, this isn't a new thing. AM radio was where a lot of disinformers got a massive platform like decades ago. So it's not new. Like anywhere where people can disseminate information, you're going to have bad faith actors jump in. It's just that now there's a really low barrier to entry. And so I wouldn't say that's a net positive or a net negative. I think it's sort of it's a powerful thing, and power can be good or bad depending on whose hands it's in. And I think that it's just up to regulators and the individuals using social media to both regulate it in such a way that, you mitigate the impact that these bad actors can have. And individuals should also be, incredibly critical with the media that they consume, and equipped to be critical by education systems that need to have more funding and smaller class sizes, and actually be able to teach these critical thinking skills that allow people to consume media in this modern environment where there's so much of it, in a way that allows them to be empowered rather than disempowered and disinformed.
And
so
speaking
I kind of
of,
popped out your question though. I didn't really answer it, but
well, it's kind of more of a thought exercise anyway, because we have social media. It's not like we can just say, oh, it's not really working that well for us, let's scrap it. So we're kind of working within that framework. But speaking of that empowerment piece and people feeling empowered to maybe use social media to connect with audiences, we have freedom of press in Canada. And at the same time, being a journalist means something, I think. So where do you draw the line between someone being a journalist and not being a journalist? And I just want to provide a little bit of context to why this is particularly an important question for me. So I cover local stories where I live. I've covered the municipal election. I typically will cover stories about queer advocacy, social issues. And I have this shirt here that says press on it. And it was kind of a little bit of a cheeky response to the RCMP trying to trespass me from their property, well, public property, for covering a story about the Kwikwetlem RCMP. So I'm curious to know, like, I obviously, put this on a shirt as a way to try to give myself some sort of legitimacy, even though I should already have that legitimacy.
Yeah.
But it got a lot of blowback on social media from people saying you're insulting journalists by doing this. And so I'm curious to get your take on all of that.
Oh my God. I mean, first of all, don't be so precious, people, okay? Like, if one person who does journalism wearing a shirt that says press makes you feel like the entire institution's under attack, then maybe you need to think about how precarious your your confidence in the concept of journalism is. But I would say that journalism, in my mind, is a practice, not a person, if that makes sense. So it's not about necessarily, if you are telling stories with a focus on trying to get your facts as right as possible, giving people a say who you talk about in the stories that you're telling, within reason. If you are doing it not to try to drive a narrative, but with the goal of informing people so they can make their own decisions and be better informed to make their own decisions about things, you're doing journalism. Like, it's, and to me, it doesn't matter if you do it independently or for a major media corporation. It doesn't matter if you do it on a podcast, on TV, on radio, in a print newspaper, or on TikTok. If you follow the tenets of journalism, if you are rigorous about pursuing the truth, and you're going to make mistakes, everyone does, but if you correct yourself when you do make those mistakes, if you do make every effort to be accurate and to be honest and to, as cheesy as it is, afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted, like, you're a journalist. And I find it so ridiculous because there are people who work for mainstream outlets who I would argue, maybe toy with the idea of, or come real close to pushing the definition of journalist because of their lack of consideration for the facts and for, not driving a narrative, and for, like, you look at the op-ed section of National Post and some of those columnists might call themselves journalists, and I find that really rich. And then there's people who maybe don't feel comfortable self-describing as journalists, like content creators and stuff, who I would argue are doing journalism. So I think that, people need to not be so precious about who can call themselves journalists and who can't, because there's a lot of people using the label who shouldn't be, and there's a lot of people not using the label who should. And it's not about the medium, it's about how you do it.
Right. And so you're saying it's not necessarily even about going to school to become a journalist either?
Oh, definitely not. There's people in mainstream newsrooms who never went to school for it. Like, you do not have to go to journalism school. And frankly, I almost feel like journalism is changing so fast that I in my experience, at least, like, the majority of the things that I learned in journalism school have not helped me at all. There's a few standout voices and professors who really made a difference, and who I respect a lot and taught me a lot, but that's like with any program. But the reality is, journalism is going through a massive period of change where mainstream newsrooms are, unfortunately, several of them are publicly traded entities who are focused on shareholder profits. And that is not what should be driving journalism. And unfortunately, increasingly is. And, I think that journalism is going through a massive period of change, and it's not going to look the same in 10 years, just as it looks extremely different from how it did 10 years ago. And so, anyone who enters it with a commitment to doing it right and not trying to, you know, just grift and make money off of scaring people, as like several people who call themselves media these days do. And that's what I should say, like, we shouldn't be precious about who calls themselves journalists, but we should be a bit precious about defending it in the context of people who outwardly misinform and lie and, you know, try to frame themselves as journalists, because that is harmful.
Are you thinking of like Rebel News or something along those lines?
Oh yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I was thinking of Rebel News, Counter Signal, Western Standard. Like I could rattle them off: Post Millennial, True North, like all of these people who claim to be journalists, but like leave out essential context in their stories that, you know, because they're trying to drive a narrative. Like if you are, or they're, the kinds of stories they tell overall create a picture that is going to panic people. Like if you cover every single time a person of color, say, commits a crime, but don't do that every time a white person does, you're going to fuel a narrative. And that is about the overall picture of your coverage as opposed to an individual story, but it still has that impact. So like there's all kinds of things that play into, you know, newsrooms harming society or helping it. And I think that if you're doing more harm than help, you really need to reconsider whether you should be calling yourselves newsrooms or journalists.
Right. And coming back to a point that you made about corporate media and some of the issues with turning media into a business, I guess, there's also CBC here in Canada that is, I mean, they do some of that, but they're also publicly funded, right? So do you see that as being a more ethical form of journalism than the corporate media? Because I know that there's a lot of bitterness among journalists in some corporate media outlets who would say, well, how come CBC's getting all this support, but we don't have support for our journalism in that way?
I don't have an issue with governments funding journalism, you know, in the way that, you know, like CBC's funding is through the Broadcasting Act. And it's like, you know, extremely arm's length from government, obviously. So like public entities, I think that it's incredibly helpful, especially for local journalism. And the only time I kind of get annoyed with CBC is when it's trying to keep up with like the rat race of mainstream media, as opposed to like the public good it represents. Like CBC, I think because they get that funding, should be doing a public good. So like they shouldn't be cutting local newsrooms, for example. Like they shouldn't be giving their executives huge bonuses while they do those layoffs. And they should be extremely, like, if they've got the money, they should be doing the stories that maybe other newsrooms don't have the resources to do, like going up to remote Indigenous communities. And like, you know, just, I think that that is a model that is better than a model based on shareholder profits, for sure. But I don't think it's necessarily the answer. Like there's not going to be enough government funding to sustain an entire media ecosystem, nor should there necessarily be. But I think that really journalism, like there's nonprofit models. I think that there's too much executive bloat in newsrooms, that there's like people making ridiculous salaries to do, I have no idea what, but it's certainly not journalism. And, you know, and then on top of that, giving money to shareholders. And like, that just doesn't make any sense to me when that could be going to journalism. So I think, I don't know what the way forward is or what the solution could be for like funding journalism in the most ethical manner, because the reality is even what I do, I'm not making money from my work because I'm trying to figure out what is ethical there. So I don't have the answers there, but if I figure it out, you will be the first to know.
Well, and you raised the point about cutting local journalism, and that's happened where I live, right? We have very little local journalism. It's one of the reasons I started covering local stories, because there was no one else to do it. So is that the solution to the fact that all of these jobs are being cut? Is that now everyday people just need to fill in the gaps using social media as their outlet? Or is there some other solution that you can see?
I mean, the solution in some ways would be for CBC and stuff to not cut those newsrooms in the first place, or to re-implement themselves, or for there to be nonprofit models of journalism in these, you know, like maybe governments helping, I don't know. there's a lot of people who put a lot more time and thought into these monetization models than me. So I don't want to like speculate and throw out ideas that are totally not informed and maybe have been tried and failed. But I do certainly think that a lot of citizen journalists and indie journalists are filling the gaps and doing incredible work. And to me, that is the answer, because the answer certainly is not, you know, just having these areas become news deserts. But unfortunately, you know, one thing that's difficult about that is, as we discussed, it's very hard to make money off of indie journalism. And also there can be bad actors who go in and don't do it as ethically as you do it. For example, like there's going to be people who pop in and, like, for example, True North sent one of their reporters to PEI to cover the student protests with international students from India. And he's been covering it in so irresponsibly. And with, you know, like he's been liking, before Twitter made posts private, while he was in PEI, he was liking posts with racial slurs for Indians, like for folks from India. And it was just like really messed up. And that's the kind of thing that the bad actors or the bad faith journalism that can pop up that isn't being countered by enough local journalism. And at least PEI has some local journalism, you know, like you got to think about the communities where that can pop up and do real harm locally without you know, the only reason that we know that the migrants eating pets story isn't real before the big newsrooms jumped in on it was because the Springfield News Sun, the local paper in Ohio, spoke to the police and fact checked it. So I don't know, it's sort of a two-pronged thing where there can be bad actors who pop up in these news deserts, but that's why we need people like you to pop up and do it right. But you also shouldn't have to do that for free. So I don't really know what the answer is there.
Yeah, I mean, that's part of the thing too. And I'm curious to know what your goals are for the future of your own journalism work, because like you said, you're not really making a living off of the independent stuff at the moment. So is the goal to eventually make that financially feasible? Do you have other goals in what you want to see from this endeavor?
Long term, I don't really know, because certainly what I'm doing now isn't the most sustainable. I mean, I'm working a full-time job and making journalism, doing all the journalism I do in my spare time on top of that. And I'm very tired.
I bet.
Yeah, but I'm passionate, and that passion keeps me going for now. You know, there's other opportunities that arise related to the profile I'm building through my journalism. So, you know, I can do panels and stuff or MC events. But, you know, that's additional work that I'm compensated for in that, you know, in those moments that I'm doing that work. And I also have to ethically weigh who is asking me to MC an event and, you know, consider how that could impact the perception of bias in my journalism and things like that. So I honestly don't know. I mean, I like to fantasize about the idea of one day in the future starting my own newsroom and using sort of a Defector style model, like how Defector has all of these sort of independent people coming together with doing their journalism, and they, as I understand it, sort of govern or run the business by committees, and everyone kind of plays their part. They do a committee that they feel is the least awful and they handle the business side basically collectively without having to have that executive bloat. And, you know, they're able to kind of monetize off of their various projects. And I guess that's sort of the thing, is you just kind of have to get over that hump and get to a place where you're able to get advertiser interest. And I don't know if that exists in the kind of journalism that I do, if there's ever a point when advertisers deem, you know, a political journalist who covers neo-Nazis and attacks on trans lives and things as brand safe enough for them to offer me advertising deals. And I don't know whether I would accept them if they did. I'd have to weigh all the ethics there. And it's just a really complex, difficult thing. So I don't know exactly what the future holds, but I do know I care a lot about this and I intend to do it for a long time. And I really hope I can find a way to do it that allows me to also, like, maybe have kids one day if I want to do that. And, you know, if that kid needs braces, I can pay for that. Or if they need to, like, go to therapy, I can afford to pay for them to go to therapy. Because if their mom is getting death threats from neo-Nazis all the time, maybe they need a little therapy, you know? So it's hard. It's a really hard calculation, but I'm tenacious and I think I'll find a way. And, you know, if you figure it out, let me know too.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope you find a way to get there. And similar question, but in I guess, a slightly different vein. What is your hope for the future of journalism itself?
I'm hopeful that it will be less ruled by executives concerned about perception of bias and who don't understand the ways in which that can be manipulated on social media, and more so run by the kinds of ethical, hardworking, badass journalists like yourself, like several friends of mine who currently work in mainstream newsrooms, but maybe are having certain stories, you know, censored as like reporting on Palestinians, for example. I would like to see a world where journalism is done from a place of wanting to make the world a better place, with no focus on whether it's going to get advertiser dollars, no concern about that, no concern about whether it's going to provoke outcry or piss people off, and instead just focus on whether it's helping people, whether it's informing people, and whether it's going to make the world a better place. And I understand that that's got all kinds of pitfalls, because who defines what makes the world a better place and stuff, but it's I don't know. I'm optimistic that we're going to see more badass independent shops pop up that counter the dominant, often outdated narratives that predominate a lot of the coverage in mainstream newsrooms. And we see a lot more work being done from the perspectives of racialized folks, gender diverse folks, you know, stories that actually reflect the lives of these people in their communities and in their humanity, so that we stop seeing. We have all of these stories that can combat the efforts to dehumanize so many of these vulnerable communities that we're seeing right now. So yeah, I don't know. I hope that there's a future where a lot of people take up the mantle of doing journalism wherever they need to do it, and do it right. And I think there's a lot of hope for that.
Yeah, I'm glad to see that you're feeling hopeful about that, and I hope to see that as well. And one of the questions I ask in all of these episodes is what our audience can do to help. So in this case, what can our audience do to help that future of journalism that you're hoping to see?
Honestly, just support these independent journalists. Like, you know, if you have the means to subscribe, which I know not everyone does, there's a lot of really great outlets out there that are doing badass indie work. And, you know, like there's the Tyee, there's Press Progress, there's The Breach, there's, you know, there's the Rover, there's all of these indie shops that are popping up that are doing really compassionate, really ethical journalism. And they do it because they care, not because they want to make money or because they want to, you know, see their name in lights or whatever, you know. And I would say support journalism where you can. And even if you don't have the means, like, there's so much currency in having a following. So literally hit that follow button on the creators who you want to support, and push back on the ones you don't. Don't be afraid to say when something is, like, especially when it's from those bad actors at like Rebel News and stuff. Don't be afraid to push back on those narratives and use the tools that are available online to increase your ability to consume media critically, I would say, is another big one. So, you know, and try to share those tools with your friends. Like, there are websites out there that whose names are escaping me right now that try to teach those basic sort of critical thinking skills with respect to how you consume media. If you're listening to this podcast, you probably already know, because you found these indie journalists and you know, probably consume media critically. But try to think critically, support journalists you care about, support journalists that you believe are in it for the right reasons. And that support can look like anything from hitting like, hitting subscribe, or genuinely, you know, subscribing with your checkbook.
Absolutely. And is there anything else that we haven't talked about with regard to ethics in journalism so far that you think would be important to add before we start wrapping things up?
I would just say that even though things can feel really bleak, especially if you look at the commentary section of the National Post, there's a lot of really good people doing really good work, it may be in less traditional packages. And I think that overall people want to be informed, and the people who are telling these stories want to do it accurately. And there are bad actors, definitely, but I think that you always have to have hope that the desire to be informed and the desire to inform people from a place with empathy and compassion will always win. And yeah, maybe it's Delulu, but I cling to that, and I hope you do too, because I think that there's a really a bunch of really cool work happening that we can all get really excited about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And thank you again so much for being on this podcast. This has been a social justice podcast. I'm your host, NICOLA SPURLING. Today I've been joined by Rachel Gilmore for a conversation about ethics in journalism.
Thanks so much.
You've been listening to a social justice podcast, an exploration of our world's social issues, hosted by NICOLA SPURLING on the traditional and unceded territories of the Kwikwetlem, Katzie, and Qayqayt peoples.